Mike. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Sorry. All right. We're here for a workshop tonight, and we're going to start with the interim report of the Ad-Hoc Committee on Rental Registration. David Hediger, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Mayor. All right. So, as you've noted, it is the interim report, and I will get to why this is the interim report in a moment. First, just want to thank the committee to start with. We've had 9 meetings since July. There's 11 members, and then Ed providing a great deal of staff assistance to this whole committee. So a lot of people have been taking a lot of Wednesday nights out of their daily routine and spending it with me and Ed. So I appreciate that. And it looks like we're going to ask for more time. So anyway, you folks in let's see, June, or I should say May, had a hearing regarding a rental registration that was proposed to you folks by Planning and Code Enforcement at that time. That was largely put together by the Public Health Committee in conjunction with our department, and that was really a result of the comprehensive plan looking at a way to come up with additional staff to help with code enforcement efforts. There was a lot of comments at that workshop. The majority of them were negative that evening. I'd say the majority of folks were really concerned about additional fees, additional costs. It's another bill that you have to pay in order to do business in Lewiston. And I should say what was drafted at that time really was a mechanism to provide staff funding. So there was a number in it, and people kind of got freaked out because they saw the number in there about how much it was going to cost per unit and what we were looking to actually make. As a result of that, on the 19th, you folks created an ad hoc advisory rental registration committee. And we were charged to see if the city should not or should adopt a rental registration program. And there's a copy of that resolve in your package here tonight, and I'm going to reference that towards the end. So as I mentioned, we've met, I think, 9 times since then. And at one of the very first meetings, and I'm going to be going through this memo here, so you'll see where I'm going as I'm working through this document. But on the 26th, the committee made a very specific motion. The motion was to not support the rental registration proposal presented to the City Council in May in the form in which it was presented. Basically, the vote was 7 with 1 abstention on that. And there was a number of reasons for that. Basically, they were concerned about the fee that was associated with it at that time. If there was going to be a need for ramped up or additional code enforcement, it shouldn't necessarily be borne solely by the specific property owners, but maybe it should be a holistic approach, like, hey, maybe we should just increase the tax in the community overall to actually fund these positions. During that discussion, the committee also recognized that there's a need to collect more accurate information so we can reach property owners and managers. That's been like an underlying theme from day one as far as the different agencies between planning and code enforcement, police and fire. When there's a need to reach somebody, how accessible is the information do we have? How accurate is it? What can we do to improve that? So I think the majority of the committee recognizes that it would be beneficial to have better contact information for purposes of emergencies. And how can we integrate that into some of our existing software? You folks have heard us reference EnerGov. That's largely a planning and code enforcement software, but it's also used heavily by the clerks and to a lesser degree by some other departments. How can we make that program more accessible and more useful to help us get that information? So, the committee came up with 5 goals, and there's a lot of text in here, and I don't know that you folks have gone through it all, but I'm going to try to summarize it. Just going over what those 5 goals are in their entirety. Goal number 1, to protect the health and safety of our residents by ensuring the health and safety of our rental properties. 2, attract and support property owners who are committed to providing healthy and safe housing. 3, educate and provide resources for the general public so they can assess the health and safety of rental properties and units. 4, educate and provide resources for owners and renters so they can succeed, hold both accountable for the health and safety of their property. And 5, address inappropriate and illegal activity in and around multifamily properties. So with those 5 goals, the committee spent several meetings going over what the actual recommendations should be for those. And it does get kind of wordy in here, and that's part of the reason why we're going to ask you folks for additional time to try to refine this a little bit more. With respect to Goal 1 has the most recommendations in it. One of those recommendations is to clarify the roles and responsibilities of fire prevention and code enforcement. And largely what that's all about is the suggestion of fire department being kind of the first line of defense. They would go out, they would be the more proactive ones with respect to inspections. They do some of that now with their engine companies. During the winter months, that slows down given the way that their staffing is structured and using the engines out there. But the thought is if we can make them a more proactive approach, that would be beneficial towards the quality of housing in the community. And then code enforcement would be kind of the heavy. They would be the ones that would deal with the more serious matters, the ones that would have to take issues to court. And that's frankly kind of how we operate now. I think this suggestion would be a little bit more, a higher expectation probably on the fire side as far as the number and amount of inspections that occur. But at the same time, code enforcement would be the one that's responding to complaints. It would be more complaint driven. And again, it would be kind of situations where they get ugly and we have to involve an attorney. That would fall in code. Provide city staff with improved technology. I believe you folks will hear at some point, if not part of the upcoming budget, maybe sooner, I'm not sure, the need to try to get some better technology for staff, primarily planning and code enforcement. That would be tablets. The idea, if we can get out in the field and we can actually bang out some of these inspections in the field instead of having to come back to the office, log them in, deal with all the complaints, phone calls, interruptions that occur in the office, but actually get a lot of this stuff done in the field, you'd be a little more efficient with that. Fire department has some new technology as well that they're looking at. I don't know all the details of that, but that's supposed to be making them more efficient as well. And ideally, that's going to talk to our software as well. So again, we have a lot of this, and there's been some discussions about making the information more transparent, and that will come up here as well. But I keep on talking about EnerGov, and we've for better or for worse, we have a big commitment into that. It does some things very well, does other things that we don't even know about. We really need to try to embrace that and take advantage of it, but we need some additional software and assistance to make that happen. Adopt the goal to inspect all 3-unit and larger properties within a 3 to 5 year period. So this could happen potentially if the fire department ends up being more proactive. They have an automated system where they could actually go out and do inspections in a more proactive approach. Again, some of that's going to involve a change in software and whatnot. We don't necessarily want to be duplicating efforts between planning and code and the fire department. That sometimes happens now, and that's not, if we're going to try to be proactive and more efficient, we need to figure out ways to avoid that. One of the recommendations was to improve the communication between fire and code. I'd say we have a pretty good relationship now, but there's always room for improvement there. In the same section, it talks about consideration being given to cross-training between the two departments. That's probably not a bad idea because there's certain aspects of the property maintenance code that kind of dip into life safety requirements, but we don't necessarily enforce the life safety code like the fire department does. So for us to have an understanding of what their expectations are and vice versa, and just to improve upon that, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, regardless if you guys support this at the end of the day, we're going to work to improve that anyway. It just makes for a better relationship and more efficient and less redundancy between the two departments. The frequency for which fire inspects a property should be tied to some type of risk analysis. Larger, older buildings should be inspected with greater frequency. Another thought would be maybe looking at areas where there's a greater density, where you have a lot of units, the buildings are right on top of each other, where, you know, if something happens terrible with one building, the likelihood of other buildings being impacted is significant. Could be like a neighborhood like Little Canada or something like that, where the buildings are right on top of each other. One of the recommendations in this group, in this category too, is actually an additional staff person as part of Lewiston's fire prevention department. As some of you know, that department had 2 folks, then at one time it went back down to 1 inspector, and now it's back up to 2 inspectors. The thought is if you added a 3rd inspector to that, that would help during the downtime, like this time of year when the engine companies aren't doing the inspections. You could have that 3rd inspector assist the other 2 in trying to be more proactive during these colder months. Let's see. There's a reference in here too about third-party inspections. If we would be willing to, we being the city, be willing to consider third-party inspections. We heard from some committee members and actually some of the public too about inspections that are provided from like insurance companies, Lewiston Housing, HUD. If those inspections are good for those entities, why aren't they good for the city, good enough for the city, you know, with respect to the conditions of the property? That may be something to consider. I mean, we'd have to look at what those inspections consist of. Do they meet our expectations? Do they not meet them? But again, if they do, that might be an avenue where, hey, we don't need to go and inspect your property. We'll take the inspection that you have from some other source. Establishing general assistance housing inspection and tenant program. Keep in mind, we're still under goal 1 here with all these recommendations. You folks have already made some tweaks to this language. This is all about planning, code enforcement, doing GA inspections. We've started that. Staff was, you know, supportive of the intent of it, but we were also cautiously going into it cautiously, I guess is the way to say it, because we didn't know how many inspections were all of a sudden were going to get assigned to us. To date, it hasn't been a problem. I mean, staff has been able to handle the additional inspections that we're receiving from the GA department. So far, so good. I mean, if we get an influx like of new requests like we did years ago, it'll be a problem. I mean, we'll be putting away some of the other enforcement actions and going towards these, but for the time being, it's working out well. Continued dangerous building enforcement demolition program. Again, the council's been very supportive of this over the years. Ever since we had all those tragic fires, you folks have agreed to, you know, support the condemnations. We have a certain amount of money there too that goes towards demolitions, and quite frankly, we've been getting a lot of people to pay for the demolitions and not have to use as many city funds as we thought we did. So the recommendation is to continue that program and use it when necessary and appropriate. Implement a lead safety online registry. There's actually a state law that, you know, with respect to the whole lead program that says that the state is supposed to be doing a registry program now. They're really not. It's voluntary. It's hard to find. It's not what one might think it might be. So one of the recommendations is that the city possibly partnering with some organization, maybe like Healthy Eye or Scoggin, to have a registry where properties are listed as being either lead safe or lead free. We hear that from property owners. That, you know, they'd like to know, and I shouldn't say even so much property owners as tenants, you know, what's the condition of this property, hasn't been abated, things like that. The state does have that list, and we can get that through our lead abatement program upstairs that Travis Mills runs. But when we get that list and how timely it is, it's not as responsive as any one of us would like. I mean, sometimes it takes us time to produce data. It takes that much longer to get that type of information from the state. So we've done goal 1. All right. Goal 2, attract and support property owners who are committed to providing healthy and safe housing. Part of the thought here was maybe we could do almost like a pilot project. You folks are aware of the Choice Neighborhood program that Misty Parker has been working on. Doesn't make sense to potentially look at that area or a similar area where you could potentially have some incentives where people voluntarily participate in the program. That could be registering their properties and including the information that we've discussed, like lead status, number of bedrooms per unit, emergency owner contact information, things like that. you pass an inspection from the city, from planning, from code enforcement, from the fire department, and your compliance. And in exchange for that, maybe there's an incentive. People have talked about solid waste. People have talked about getting, like first priority to a CDBG loan or low interest rates. So somehow there's a carrot here, an incentive for people to want to participate in a program where you're providing some additional information. Goal 3, educate and provide resources for the general public so they can assess the health and safety of rental properties and units. There's almost some redundancy in here. One, again, is upgrading the city's code enforcement system, EnerGov. Again, having some public portal. We've talked about this before. In fact, we tried to get some money for it last year and it didn't happen, where one of the things we hear about now is, can I look up my property and see if there's any outstanding notices of violation? The answer is no. You got to call somebody, and you got to have that somebody in front of a computer to be able to tell you what the status of that property is. Can we make that information public? Actually, we can. Cost something, but the technology and the software is there, so we can do that. Assessing, for them to do a more complete job as far as gathering information on units when they go out there. The example being right now, they may go into a building and note that's a 3-unit with 6 bedrooms, but they don't necessarily know the number of bedrooms in each unit. That's good information to have. Certainly GA likes that when they know how many vouchers they're issuing to a certain size family. Is that a 1-bedroom unit? Is that a 3-bedroom unit? That information isn't readily accessible at this point. All we know is that it's a 3-unit with X number of bedrooms in it. Goal 4, educate and provide resources for owners and renters so they can succeed, hold both accountable for the health and safety of the property. So are there ways that we can provide both owners and renters information, the information they need to make their properties health and safety, and so they can succeed? What can we give them in advance potentially, so that they know they're making a good decision either to buy a property or to live in a property? Recommendations include some type of checklist from code and fire that we would be able to give out to people in advance, so they kind of have an idea as to, what are the big items that we're looking for. I mean, both departments, quite frankly, could give them a list 1 to 100 and it probably wouldn't have every code requirement on it, but we could probably still give them a shorter list that hits the items that most frequently are being issued or for which notices of violation are being issued by either fire or planning and code enforcement. So that's something that we could consider. City could offer a training class for landlords and property managers covering code requirements and how to meet them. Quite frankly, there's just some people out there that don't get it. And is there any way we could do some outreach in advance for both parties so they have a better understanding of what the expectations are from a fire code, building code, property maintenance code perspective? Provide an incentive for general assistance clients to attend some type of training, so they understand how to maintain their units and whatnot. We would have to do more research to see if that is, if we could require that, or if that is actually just something that we could offer people. There's some question about whether or not we can mandate that. One of the requirements, one of the discussions was, let's mandate that training, and it's not as clear as that. Something we could certainly do on a voluntary basis, but any opportunity we have potentially to educate people on how to make healthy lifestyle choices while they're renting their apartments. Healthy Androscoggin, they already have a large effort in the community, but how can they be a bigger part of this discussion with respect to lead education, healthy housing choices, things of that nature? And pursue higher GA rental payments to assure landlords are adequate, to assure landlords of adequate rental income to assure healthy and safe properties. I could probably speak to it better than I can as far as the rates that are being provided for GA purposes, and it's not enough, quite frankly.
One other element that gets in there is under the GA statute. There are 2 payment limitations. So they have categories in which we can provide funding, one of which is housing, food, medicine, stuff like that. but then there's an overall limitation. And quite frequently, because of the requirement to provide certain amounts in certain categories, the amount of rent that is shown for, say, a one-bedroom at, say, $550 has to be reduced because the maximum we're allowed to give out is maybe $575, and we have to provide so much for food and so much for other things, so it actually ends up reducing the amount the landlord receives below what the state specifies as a reasonable rent, which is probably too low to begin with.
And finally,
Sorry,
goal.
can I ask on that?
Sure.
Reasonable rent for our area or reasonable rent is set across the whole state?
It's set by area.
Thank you.
So ours are considerably lower than Portland's. They're comparable to Bangor's.
Okay, great, thank you, sorry.
Lastly, goal 5, address inappropriate and illegal activity in and around multifamilies. Illegal activity and poor behavior are typically found around properties that we find lots of violations, whether they're fire violations or code violations. You folks are aware that the police department has a policy in place for disorderly properties. That current policy, it talks about the number of police calls for service for a certain category, and as a result, a building with a large number of calls may not receive an intervention because the calls can either not be tracked to a particular unit in the building or they're spread out between many units. So one of the recommendations is a second standard could be applied, so it's actually the number of calls are scaled to the number of units in that building there. You get a 3-unit and it has 10 calls, that might be a lot compared to 10 calls in a 30-unit building or something to that effect. So how do we look at that? If they did that, though, there's some recognition that the police department might need some additional staffing to make that happen, because there's a lot of monitoring that goes on with that. Right now it's the police officer is actually going out and contacting the landlord afterwards, tracking the different types of complaints that are received. Consider notifying property owners of all police calls to a service property. Oddly enough, there are property owners that have no idea about the activity that's going on at their property because they're not present. They're out of town. They have no idea. They're collecting a check. They got a property management company that's taking care of it. They're not aware that the place is a real problem for police.
That would probably require our having their email addresses because it would be quite expensive and difficult to notify them by mail. So we'd have to have some easy method of contacting the owners.
Have the police department to consider and expand programs like the funding that they received in the past for Operation Hotspots, continue to look for sources like that and continue to do different programs like that, targeting drug enforcement and things of that nature. See whether or not we can integrate police calls into the city's GIS. That's readily accessible mapping software now, and if there was a way to integrate that so you could click on 27 Pine Street and see how many times the police have been here. And then consider adopting a city ordinance that would penalize tenants who vandalize property. That's an underlying theme that comes up often as far from landlords is, you're hitting me up for tenant bad behavior, why don't you go after the tenants? And that's not an easy issue for the city to resolve. There's some language that might suggest that we do that, but at the end of the day, we've been holding the property owner responsible for them to make the decisions about the type of tenants and the behavior that's happening there. Goal 6, I lied, I thought I had 5, it's 6.
We forgot to put that one on the first list.
That's all right.
This
That's
one
right.
came up right at the end of the most recent meeting, I
That's
think.
right. Yeah, seek additional funding and whatever's out there for money to help any of this happen, right? Ed did some number crunching and he figured it was $63 million to address all the leg concerns in the community. So, we need $63 million and that will just take care of the lead, never mind the existing PMC and behavior issues that we have. So, this is the interim report that we have at this point. The reason we're asking for more time, that the committee would like more time, is when you look at the resolve, which is the next page in your document there, If you go to the bottom of it, there are a number of duties that you folks assigned to us, 4 of them. And after reviewing this document, the committee agreed, yeah, great, we've done a lot of work, but we haven't necessarily finished what you folks have asked us to do. The duties included discussing and defining goals of such a program. Arguably, we've done that. Outline the resources and staffing levers required to meet these goals. We've touched upon that, but I don't think we've completed that thought necessarily. We've talked a little bit about some of the things that we need to do tonight, but we haven't gotten to the weeds as to the costs. Recommend whether such a program should be adopted by the council, and if so, the specific nature of the program. We haven't done that. We haven't necessarily recommended a program. We've come up with a bunch of ideas, but we haven't necessarily said, is there a program that should be adopted? And then finally, if a program is recommended, determine how much that program should be funded and implemented. Again, we've talked a little bit about some of the funding, not necessarily the sources of it, but what the costs would be. And if we're going to do that, arguably, we should probably have some type of implementation schedule with this too. Are any of these things prioritized over another source? Who's going to be responsible? Are there going to be any deadlines associated with this? So with that, the committee's looking to, for extra time to meet until, or to come back to you folks by the end of February, or sometime after the end of February, with what would hope to be a final report. There's already committee members that are interested in kind of working in subgroups to try to get things done. I know Charlie Weaver on the police side, he said that, hey, great, tell me when and I'll get together with the right guys over at PD and we'll start talking about our section of the recommendations. I've already been talking to Fire, and they're more than willing to meet with Planning and Code so we can get our act together. And there's some committee members that are already expressed interest in, getting together and trying to tag some of these items in here.
One other quick comment. In your packet, there's a memo that I prepared for the committee that covered a lot of background information I think you would all find interesting. Talks about the property mix in the community, the buildings by size, age, which is clearly an issue for our community given the age of a lot of this housing, lead concerns, our inspection program, how much support the system is getting through general assistance, and a little bit on demolition. So I thought that was it was really kind of interesting for me to start digging through some of that stuff, because I think it gave me a better understanding, or at least a broader understanding of what the situation is in housing, particularly multifamily housing in town.
Questions from council? Do the questions for them first. We'll hit public, then we'll come back.
Hi. A couple of questions. Notice of violations, how do they currently go out to property owners if we don't have email addresses?
We do everything by regular mail and certified mail.
Is it possible to have a cost associated with that? If, not right now. if you
Yeah,
don't
no,
have it, but-
absolutely. I mean, there's a cost for every certified letter. It actually goes up, so our budget goes up for mailing purposes with
Okay.
respect to that. But we
And-
do both forms, one so we have a record of them receiving it, and if they deny receipt of it, well then, hopefully they got, the regular mail version of it as well.
Okay, and what's the time frame for responding to a notice of violation usually?
It varies. Typically, we give 30 days. If it's a violation that's an immediate life safety issue or something, it can be, tomorrow to within several days that the correction needs to happen. We put 30 days on a lot of things because depending on what the item is, there's an appeal period of anywhere from 10 days to 30 days that someone has the ability to appeal something. So if they don't exhaust their remedies within 30 days, they haven't talked to us, they haven't come back with an implementation schedule, it's just silence. Then at that point we decide whether or not we're going to issue citations or take legal action.
And you're obtaining these addresses from the water?
No, the addresses and current owners we get from the assessors.
Okay, great, thank you.
Isn't certified mail a requirement of these violations if we are going to take them to the next step legally?
Yeah, we have to demonstrate,
So we couldn't just email these people and
No.
call that good enough, because they can ignore that, and then we still have to certified mail.
We have to
So
demonstrate.
the email addresses for NOVs don't really help.
That's right, no,
Okay.
yeah.
Any other questions? Return it to the public?
Yeah, I have a few. It was brought up that the fee-based proposal that kind of preceded this process really ignited the opposition, and that nearly, they nearly took over the process, and it really what slowed us down quite a bit, in my opinion. We worked real hard to try and create an inspection system that was reasonable so that we could reduce costs and stuff, because the original proposal, which was not done by the committee, it was done by a staff person, really assumed a lot of things about what you could collect and then kind of work backwards, and I think that was a thing that kind of bogged us down. You know, so we wanted to keep costs down and still deal effectively with safety. You know, the lead issue about toughen up the standards, you know, can we at least get a safer free thing? Those are great things. I think in here we worked very hard on goals and recommendations, but not really a program, and that's really the crux of being here, and obviously that was addressed. And again, to determine what costs, if any, are going to be associated with this without a program is a little bit difficulty. Technology improvements, cross-training, risk assessments, training for landlords, incentives. We talked about a lot of good things that don't necessarily cost extra money. The GA inspections, I think, are a big leap forward. The fact that we'll know the adequacy of these buildings before we allow people to get a voucher from the city, I think, is critically important. Jay Allen's in the audience here. He's familiar to this council. I personally think he was treated unfairly during this process, and you know, he was replaced, and I never really felt good about that, and I still don't feel good about that. Again, it slowed the process to a halt, and you know, there were some rude behaviors, but I commend staff for kind of keeping it together at times, and the rest of the committee members. You know, it seemed that the big debate was over the cost, not what we're proposing to do. So I hope that commitment from the landlords and whatever. And I also think that there was not enough representation from people who rent units. There was a lot of criticisms of people who are renters. There was also some criticisms of landlords during this process too. And I think everybody in the city should understand we have good landlords and bad landlords and good tenants and bad tenants. So, but I don't think their voice was heard in the process. There was, you know, they were thrown under the bus quite a bit because they weren't represented on the committee wholly. I think that's always a problem. You should have people who are most affected by these policies, be they the landlords or the tenants, to be part of it. So. And again, I think that it's hard without a program to determine what, if any, costs or resources will be necessary. And I do like the grant parts of this. I don't. If we can figure out a way to get the information necessary and to realize some of the goals and recommendations, I think that would be great. And I commend, like I said, again, staff and also committee members really for meeting. This isn't easy work. You know, we're not the only city that struggles with issues like this, and I think we're making some good first steps. I'm a little bit disturbed that the fee structure that was suggested by someone outside of the Ad-Hoc committee really fueled a lot of the issues, and that was unfortunate because we, you know, without a program, we don't really know how much it costs, and I think that was done kind of backwards. So, and again, I would appreciate if the council can move forward on an extension. I think that it's, and we're looking for a couple of months, I think, David, is what we're requesting, and I think that's reasonable, especially December being not a big month, and we wanted to get to you well before the 28th date to request that. So, and I would kindly request the council to reflect on that and support that if they choose. So thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The software with regards as to the fire department, the integration with the code enforcement, the chief last year in the budget budgeted for new software that would help the fire department upgrade their information. I'm sure that we don't want to create an extra expense to see if that software integrates with the city's software, or do we know that already?
I'm not sure I can tell you that the fire chief does have that software and is starting the implementation process.
I can actually speak to it a little bit. I've had recent conversations. Just quickly, they are starting the implementation or the building of the software, I guess, so to speak. So that process is underway. We are still working with Tyler Technologies, who is the parent company of our EnerGov and some of our other softwares, and trying to get that integration. Software companies don't always play nice together. It's kind of proprietary, so they have to kind of do that. So we are trying to see if we can get that integration easily without a whole lot of steps and manual process in between. But we are that's in the works.
Right. Reason that I asked is for a number of years, the fire department has had an extensive informational bank with regard as to public, or I should say the safety code violations, as well as ownership and management companies. I believe when I was there, we shared that with the code enforcement office. I just want to make sure that that keeps going. Also, you mentioned the police department. Will they be looking at software, or the city looking at software that would be integrated so that they can bring up an address and or an ownership as well?
What we will probably end up doing is trying to integrate our water billing system with EnerGov. Those softwares by the same company, and then making the information available in EnerGov available to all the departments that need it, so that you could go to one place and find the right contact information, and it would be as up to date as we're aware of in the city. Most of the time, the water database is the most accurate, most current, because people are paying water bills.
Yeah. One more question here. On goal number 2, the first paragraph, last sentence, it says participating building owners would be required to, and it says voluntarily register. Why do we have voluntarily there if you want to require them to do it?
Well, it would be, it wouldn't, it probably is misworded. It should have been worded there'd be no charge for it, but there would be a potential penalty for failure to register.
I guess my question comes back, if it's volunteer, how can you have a penalty?
That's what I was saying, it was probably misworded, and we'll try to correct that in the final version.
I think that's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Questions, comments? If you want to. Comment when you like.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, first of all, I just want to thank the committee. I think that it was faced some challenges in the beginning, and I appreciate you sort of coming back and working so hard on this. I also appreciate the out-of-the-box thinking that I think staff probably helped guide you with, because I think that particularly in a government the size of Lewiston, it can be hard to sort of look at processes and systems and figure out how you're going to do things differently than you've always done them. And so I really appreciate that, and I know that that's not easy. Things that I really, first of all, I think that the proposals in here are really great. I read this, I felt like it was a fair representation to both property owners and tenants. I didn't feel like it was skewed either way, which everything else I've seen around this conversation always is, and so I really appreciated that. I really like the recommendation around collaboration between the fire department and code. I think that that's sort of one of those out-of-the-box thinking things that has been kind of in front of us, but has been hard for us to see. And so I think that bringing that to the table has been really important. I want to point out that the need for data and contact information is vital to this. Both, I think, for property owners, but I think also for the city. We've had conversations, or I've had conversations at least with, and I know others have, with the police department, the fire department. I served on that downtown building task force, I think it was 5 years ago when Mayor McDonald did the appointments for that. And we were having those conversations then about how important the up-to-date contact information is. And so to be 5 years down the road again and still not have access to that, I think we really kind of need to make that a priority. Let's see. Following up on what Councilor Lyson said, really, happy to see that we've implemented the inspections for general assistance properties. I'm interested, to keep an eye on that and sort of see how that goes, and to know from you, Dave, that that's not sort of an overwhelming responsibility for your guys, that seems to be working
At this point,
well.
it's not a problem.
In terms of offering carrots for compliance, I shared with the two of you some examples of what Portland is doing in terms of offering incentives to get folks to sort of go along with rental registration. I think that that's important. I know we just had a brief conversation about penalties for folks who don't participate. I think I'd like to see us do some kind of implementation about, sort of positive reinforcement for participation before we kind of try to, drop the hammer on folks on something that we may not actually understand fully. Ed, you and I have talked about how, currently if a building is under lead abatement, somebody could be trying to purchase the property and not know that that lead abatement is an issue, and so end up owning a property that they then have to invest $60,000 in, which I know has actually happened in real life. Figuring out how we can, and maybe this is my job come January, figuring out how to tie those lead abatement orders to the Registry of Deeds so that that information is accessible. And then, not lastly yet, I really would like to see us do some work around the disorderly property ordinance. I think we need to reassess that so that we're not expending resources on behalf of the code enforcement department, but also on the part of our police force, who, in one instance has showed up to a building 85 times because it's not meeting the standards of our current ordinance. To me, that's ridiculous and is a waste of resources and officer time. And then I think, lastly, what I appreciate about this proposal is that it feels to me like we're setting everybody up for success. And that is really, I think, important. Because I think taking care of our housing stock really benefits the entire community, whether you're a property owner or a tenant. And that's it.
I do have one more.
Go ahead. Thank you. When the program is accepted and it's on its way, will we continue to have a committee meeting on a monthly basis and looking at the progress as we go along for at least a couple of years? Is that a possibility?
It would be a possibility. There's another thing that has been mentioned a few times that I'm still trying to get a little bit better handle on, and that is that at one point the city council had a housing committee, and it might be appropriate to appoint a committee of the council that would work with and oversee this and deal with other housing issues as they come up, because it seems like we're constantly dealing with housing issues. So that might be something we could take a look at as well.
And lastly, is I remember when I was on the fire department and we brought the complaints to the code enforcement. Between the fire department and code enforcement time to follow through on complaints and eventually bring the individuals either to court or a fine took such a long time that many times with the lack of personnel, interest was lost, and/or information gathered may not have been available, and therefore the interest was just lost.
Yeah, we have, I think, really, and Dave and Gil, even before that, working with the fire department, we have really tried to move that, push that forward, so that right now, I guess our policy is pretty clear. If people cooperate with us in terms of agreeing on time deadlines and bringing things into compliance, everything's fine. If they don't, we very quickly now go to the attorney and have the attorney get involved. It does cost, obviously, some money. We usually try to recover that as a part of the eventual settlement. And even when we do that, it still takes a lot of staff time and a lot of effort and a lot of meetings and discussions. So it's not easy, but I think we're pushing it along a lot better than we ever used to.
Yeah, I mean, one of the approaches we've done now too, I mean, again, it's a cost, but where things used to get lost between fire and code was if we initiated a lawsuit, or quite frankly, even before that, a notice of violation would be issued, we wouldn't necessarily do a great job of following up on it because of staffing, or we've moved on because of some other issue. We've done a better job of tracking what we have for outstanding violations out there now, and that's made a big difference. We've had the city attorney help us track lawsuits too, because in the past we'd come to some type of an agreement where we're supposed to collect fees or penalties, and we were monitoring that. Well, we've moved on. The property's in compliance, and we haven't checked off if our bills have been paid and whatnot. So now we make sure that the city attorney is, staying on top of that too. And at its point, it just takes a lot of time. I mean, if we can avoid going to court, I mean, that's the goal. I mean, because it's a lot of staff time. It's more time of the property owners that we're dealing with too. And at the end of the day, it's costing everybody money to do that. So, but inevitably, we're left with no options sometimes. And that's the route we're going.
Thank you.
Council Marco.
Similarly to the comp plan, once the goals presented for final adoption by the council, and I suspect some sort of design program over the next 2 months, that program could have some sort of a checklist, couldn't it?
Yes.
So that the director of code and planning, as each item is implemented over the course of a year or two, can make a check on the checklist and present some sort of update to the council, whether
Yes.
that's annual or even quicker.
It could be done. This is, of course, a multi-departmental initiative, so it would take everybody keep tracking and reporting. So, yeah,
But
we
there
could
could be one person.
one person could be
administering.
responsible for pulling it together, yes.
All right, so this is a great interim report. I've been to a couple of these meetings, varying levels of entertainment. Very spirited in some cases. There's a lot of passion on every side of this issue. I find myself agreeing with Councilor Lewiston and Councilor Cloutier a lot in what they said. Councilor Lewiston, we started with a fee and all these code enforcement people to accomplish a goal, but we never really established the goals and what it would take to accomplish them. And I think the committee has done a good job of working backwards, looking outside the box and identifying some other places that we can do this without necessarily adding a fee or adding staff, software, third-party inspections, utilizing the fire companies that are there anyway. I think those are all really, really great things. I like the idea of mixing in some tenant accountability, because I think we too often go after only the landlords, and it's not, as Councilor Lewiston said, we have good landlords and bad landlords. We have good tenants and bad tenants. So we need to make sure we're addressing all of those items at the same time. As far as having tenants on the committee, we did pass a resolve for that. Item 3 was very specific in the makeup of that committee. That's the time to really kind of drill in. Maybe we didn't do it then. It could be retrospect. I think if we move to a housing committee of some kind, I think tenant participation is vitally important there. And we really need to be cognitive of that as we create that committee, if that's the direction we're going to go. And I'd like a recommendation from this committee on creating reinstating the housing committee and what they feel the makeup of that committee should be as a recommendation to us. Not to give them any extra work in the 2 months. I'm fine with more time. I will also agree with Councilor Cloutier. the nuisance ordinance. I know it's really close to Jay Allen's heart, and we've been talking about it for a few years. I was on that downtown task force as well. That ordinance has needed to be tightened up for the last 4 years. We need to take it to the next level, and that really needs to come in front of the council, whether it comes out of this or whether, you know, Ed and the chief and, you know, we can just do this without them. This needs to be addressed, because that does bridge that gap between some tenant accountability and some landlord accountability at the same time, you know, for the properties. And it allows the police department to help out with the code and the fire sort of issues. So that part is vitally important to me in this discussion. So keep up the good work. As far as I'm concerned, you're doing a great job. And I think with that, I will open it up to the public. Make sure, name, address, you know the drill.
I know the drill. Ronnie Parity, 82 Prospect Avenue, Chair of the Public Health Committee and a member of the Ad-Hoc Committee. I just want to mention the most important thing that I found was communication. Again, the data, transparency for both tenants and owners. The reason is because as a public health nurse and going into the different places in Lewiston, I had to get hold. There was things I found not right. And to get hold, I was lucky that I knew code. I knew fire. I know the city people, so that I was able to get hold of them. But for people who can't know who to get hold of to report something, this is very important in our program, that we can be able to report, whether it's landowners or tenants or whoever, are first responders. First responders are very, very important. And a lot of times I was a first responder as a public health nurse, and I had to call 911 and things like that. So I just want to mention that the data and communication, and we need to work all together. This is the most important thing in this whole thing. And a housing committee, I would recommend to continue. Thank you. Thank you, Shane, for appointing the committee.
Thank you, Ron.
Norman Russo, 4 Clearwater Avenue. I attended the meetings and all that. I think that everyone and all did a good job trying to work together, try to make this a better, safer, healthier community. I just wanted to share a real quick bit of information with this council that you are overlooking one other entity out there that is working very hard to improve the safety and everything else for the people of this community, which is the insurance companies. I think at one of the meetings I made you aware that they were going to cancel my insurance because they had a 3-foot trampoline out in the lady's backyard or whatever, what have you, for her to jump on, whatever, and it was overlooked, that they took care of it. But I just had an inspection on 3 of my buildings, and it's amazing with the things that are coming up with. They're much more rigid than what the city asks or what code asks or what have you. They're even asking us to make sure that our furnaces get cleaned every year. They're asking for who our contractors are, whether they're licensed, bonded, and all kinds of other things or whatever. So they're way ahead of you guys. I mean, you can't just say that you're being inspected by the city of Lewiston or by Lewiston Housing Authority or General Assistance, whoever it is. The insurance company is doing a heck of a job. And I proved that to Tom Maynard because a lot of things that you guys would pass on an inspection, whether you're in a code violation or not, I explained it to them. It's perfectly legal to have these regular tube circuit breakers. It's totally unacceptable with an insurance company. They won't insure you unless you have the new circuit breakers. They ask a lot more things than what the code enforcement asks. And I'll tell you, they're getting tougher and tougher every year. They do things like not too many shrubs around your home because it can create mold. If there's any kind of paint peeling, they tell you to either fix it right away or they're not going to insure you. So I would like for you people to think about including the insurance companies because they're way, way ahead of you guys. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Ward. I live in Auburn. I work downtown in Lewiston. I work largely with tenants, but also have regular contact with code enforcement, a lot of landlords and others. One of the things that Councilor Lyson said that really jumped out at me was that the lack of the tenant voice through the process was noticeable. I attended all but 2 of the meetings, and I have to say that reading this report, although the committee, I believe, tried to think about the tenant voice, even the drafting of the report reflects that it was not part of tenants being at the table. Even the language used in this meeting today, tenant accountability, landlord incentives, indicates that what is being looked at here is punishment for tenants who are out of line while rewarding landlords who are just doing what the law requires. It is a requirement to provide safe, healthy housing to tenants if you are a landlord. And I do believe, having been to all those meetings, that the committee is doing good work and attempting to make a positive change that will make healthier housing for Lewiston. But I do think that extension of this, also, there should be a consideration of adding a tenant advocate to the committee for those last 2 months, so that when a proposal does come before the city, it comes before the city with tenant input in mind. It comes before the city thinking about what are the actual ramifications for allowing landlords to get incentives for something so simple as reporting how your tenant's code fire can reach you. My prior work, I worked in juvenile defense. I am all about incentives. I think that, people really are motivated by positive outcomes. But it is a positive outcome to not have code knocking on your door all the time and bugging you about violations. It's a positive outcome to not have to worry about lawsuits being filed against you. And those positives are not motivating a lot of the landlords. No, I don't want to say a lot of our landlords. Let me back up. A few of our landlords with a lot of inventory. Those positive outcomes are not doing enough to motivate them at this time. And so I just ask that the council, as you're considering this proposal, as you're considering extending the time, do more to include that tenant voice, because we need positive outcomes that don't involve people living in homes where there are electrical hazards and fires can start at any moment, or bed bugs are eating them alive every single night. Code enforcement does amazing work, and they do everything that they can to be on top of violations. But as Dave said, sometimes things fall off. They're dealing with the next emergency. And that bed bug infestation that they were talking to a landlord about 3 weeks ago is going to be a little bit less of a priority when they find out that there's water coming into an electrical junction. And so I do think that it's important that the tenant voice be more included in this process, especially as this committee transitions from putting a proposal together with goals and putting together actual steps that comprise a program. Thank you for your time. Thank you to the committee for all of your work. I do recognize that everyone's working really hard to make Lewiston a better place. I just think a very important voice is missing in that process.
Hi, I'm Amy Smith. I live in Portland, and I have rental units here in Lewiston, and I served on the committee. I just wanted to make a couple of remarks. First, I want to thank you for your response to the interim report, because it was a lot of work. To get that group of people to agree to, I guess it turned out to be 6 goals and 29 specific recommendations was kind of miraculous. But I think that we all learned a lot. It was by the end, it was very respectful dialogue and very constructive conversations. And I just wanted to make a comment on this request for the extension. We realize that what we've got is goals and recommendations, but we have our commitment is to come up with a very specific, very actionable, step-by-step, detailed program that basically encompasses the recommendations. And I'm more than willing, we've got a small subcommittee already ready to go, the program design crew, and I don't know if it's complete yet, but adding a tenant voice to that would be great. But I just want you to set your expectations that when you next hear from us at the end of February, it's going to be with a solid, well-thought-out program. And the only other thing I want to say is it was a real bummer to see the headline in the Sun Journal today that said that the committee recommends against a rental registration program, because that was 100% inaccurate. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
So I'm Jay Allen, and I could talk on this topic until you fall asleep, but I know we have short time, so I won't. I would just start with this one thought. We'll all agree that I really can't find my ass with both hands, so you don't have to listen to me. What I'm saying, I think it's the duty of the council, or not, right? You'll tell me, or I'll hear, that it isn't your duty. But your duty is to decide whether or not to do a rental registration program. I mean, the work the committee did is enormous. I understand all of that. But at the end of the day, it comes down to priorities. And I'll just tell you a quick story, okay? Not that long ago, code enforcement showed up to one of the buildings that I manage. And they're certainly always welcome in our buildings. It's well known that whenever I buy a building in Lewiston, the first people that come into my buildings are code, before I even buy it, so they can tell me what I need to do. I have heaped effusive praise on the people that work in this building, whether it be code or the administration, and I mean every word of it, okay? But they came out to this building, they found a bunch of things wrong, and they found that the soffit had lead paint on it, which is absolutely true. They were 100% right. You know, and they asked us to fix it. So at the cost of approximately $6,000, I spent a week in an 80-foot man lift wrapping a soffit. And again, code is 100% right. There was lead on that soffit, okay? Now, in terms of priorities, all I would say, and I don't begrudge the fact that we spent the $6,000 on that thing, it's just there might have been a few lead chips that fell from 40 feet in the air. That $6,000 we spent there was unexpected, but we did it, okay? And I'm not really complaining. So at this same building, we decided to tear down a 4-car garage, okay, to create more parking for Lewiston. Well, primarily for that building, not for the whole city of Lewiston, but that's one of the things we need in Lewiston is more parking, okay? So again, came into the city, talked to Tom Maynard, one of my favorite guys. He said, you need a demo permit and you got to make sure there's no asbestos in it. And I applaud that. He was absolutely correct. So we did that. I got the demo permit, and then I took the time to go find an asbestos guy. He stopped by for 10 minutes and took 1 square inch of shingle. I wrote him a check for $350, and he came back and said, you don't have any asbestos, okay? So in the middle of tearing that building down today, someone from Public Works showed up with their butt on fire. He's a nice guy, by the way. I don't have any butt. Then all of a sudden, I needed excavation permits, and I needed to call DigSafe. And I would just tell you that we weren't digging anything, we were knocking down a building. So we finally got that all worked out, right? So we didn't have to stop work. And last week, one of my guys went to a building on Blake Street and parked on the street for 15 minutes and came out and they had a parking ticket. Now, it's well posted that you can't park there. I'm not arguing, I'm going to pay his parking ticket, whatever. All I'm talking about is priorities here, okay? We seem to have the time and money to hire meter people to run around on a beautiful sunny day with no snow in sight. And I'm not squawking about the parking ticket. I'm going to pay it. I'm just saying it's about priorities. We made that a priority to keep the parking square in Lewiston. And I agree with that, because if you don't, you got chaos, okay? And we decided that we want to make sure that there's no asbestos when we tear down buildings, right? We figured out how to do that, right? I paid $350 for 10 minutes, okay? So we did all that, and we figured out that a soffit that's 40 feet in the air is a danger to society, and I'm not arguing that it isn't. It's just not a major danger. So what I would encourage the council to do, for what it's worth, is to elevate these nasty buildings and the landlords that run them, at least get that up to the level of parking on the streets on a bright sunny day in Lewiston. It is, I believe it's your role to say, and again, I'm not a speech maker here, but, you know, we didn't sit around and talk about going to the moon for 20 years. Somebody stood up and said, we're going to the moon. Figure it out. And I guess that's what I'm encouraging you guys, because you have the power. That's your job, I think. And I may not know what your job is, but I think that's your job, is to say, we're going to the moon, you guys figure it out, okay? And it's not about the fee. I don't care about the fee. I've already told you, I'll pay $100 a unit. I don't even care what the fee is. And I find it disingenuous at best that anyone is squawking about a $36 fee. It just isn't true, because if it's true, you are a bad businessman or woman, and you should not own buildings in Lewiston. If $36 a year is going to put you out of business, well, then you're too close to the edge, okay? So, as far as landlord-tenant problems go, I am continually amazed by, and again, there are a lot of great landlords up here, right? I've met a lot of them. There's a bunch of bad ones. And I am continually amazed at how, I mean, these real estate titans that you have up here in Lewiston, okay, they are somehow thrown off the horse by bad tenants. And they blame the tenants for everything. And then everyone blames Pine Tree Legal. And I've done that myself. So let me be clear about this. I've done that myself. But at the end of the day, these landlords put the bad tenants in the building. They made the decision to rent to them. So, yes, there are some horrendous tenants up here. But at some point, where does the responsibility lie? And I'm not going to belabor this. You guys all know my feeling on nuisance buildings. I've been at it for 4 years, and I'm gratified to hear that there is some interest in that at this point. But I've got a building 50 feet from the two big buildings I'm doing on Blake Street that I've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on that now has 9 bullet holes in it. And they hauled a putrefied dead body out of it back in August, because whether he was murdered or not, nobody knows. So, you know, that's 158 Blake, which amazingly backs up to 125 Pierce, which is the other heinous building beside my buildings. So I'm just here to say that I would like to be involved in rewriting this ordinance at some point. I've got a lot of children in these buildings on Blake Street that I've done. And yeah, you've heard me say it before. I've got 8 Angolan families living in there, all little kids, no assistance, going to any of those units. They all manage to figure out how to work and pay their rent on time. If any bullets hit that building or hurt any of my tenants, the world is going to spin off its axis. And I know you guys have the right sort of intentions on this, and I know we'll get it done somehow. But it is unconscionable at this point that we continue to try to hold landlords blameless when they're the ones who put the drug dealers in these buildings. They rented to them. So I really don't feel bad that I'm asking you to go after the landlords. When deserved. Believe me, I've had bad tenants before too. I know the struggle. But it's up to me to get rid of the bad tenant. The landlords that are fighting rental registration and fight nuisance building ordinances, they want to be mad at the city because they have problems. You didn't ask them to buy buildings in Lewiston. You didn't. They chose to because they thought they could make a quick buck. And at this point, they can't make a quick buck because it is a self-fulfilling thing. You have a bad building that are bad units. You aren't going to get good people to move into those units, so you end up with only bad tenants. And the landlord created that themselves. So I'm the least popular man in Lewiston right now. I know it. I don't like it. I don't want to fight with anybody. Those of you that know my politics, I'm not a fan of big intrusive government, but if there was ever a time for government to do its job, it's in something like this. So, again, I don't care about the fee. It doesn't matter to me. I mean, I'll pay it or I won't pay it. Whatever. Or I'll donate it to the food bank. Whatever you want me to do. I'm just saying, in closing, I promise, that it's your job to say we're going to the moon. That's what we're doing. Fees or no fees makes absolutely no difference. The health of Lewiston depends on getting the downtown straightened out. And you guys, over the years, have done a phenomenal job knocking buildings down, doing all the things that are going on. You're going to lose a lot of tenants that don't deserve to live in some of these buildings. I know that irritates everybody in sight, but some people don't deserve to live in these buildings. And you're going to lose some landlords, because there's a lot of landlords out here that cannot manage their buildings. And by doing these inspections, you're doing them a favor, because it's going to hasten their exit. They're going to hand the buildings back to the banks, and then somebody else is going to come in and buy them and be a steward of that building. So whether you believe it or not, by being a little bit tough on the landlords right now, you're actually doing them a favor, because many of them are just hanging on. They're miserable. They hate their life. It sucks, and they've got no way out. And you can't save them all. You can't. You're going to lose, by the time you're done doing this, you're going to lose 15 to 20% of landlords up here in Lewiston. And I'm not buying their buildings. I'm just telling you right now, but you're going to lose a bunch of them. And you should welcome that. Not think it's a bad thing. And lastly, I will just tell you that there is no way to string together in the same sentence slumlord and good guy. Those things are mutually exclusive. They do not belong in the same sentence. And I've heard that up here for too long about people that you know that I'm talking about. It is not possible. You cannot be both. So don't feel bad about saying we're going to the moon, right? That's all I got to tell you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Anyone in public? No one wants to follow Jay. All right. Nice job, Jay. Back to the council. Councilor Cloutier.
So just real quickly, I just want to be clear that I support the extension. And then secondly, I'm feeling the need to clarify my comment on incentives. And so when I'm talking about incentives, I'm talking about incentives for property owners, and I'll name the people that I know the best, like Jay and Amy and Craig, who are here in this chambers often, participating in the conversation, that I feel deserve incentives, not because they're doing the minimum, but because they're here actively engaging in the conversation and actively working to do better. So I'm sorry if that was not clear the first time around.
Councilor Ray.
So I wanted to ask Dave, So it seems like we may have added another assignment to address the housing committee. Is that something you would plan to do with this ad hoc committee, or you would do amongst staff?
Well, if I heard the mayor, he's looking for a recommendation from this committee to establish a housing committee.
Whether or not to and how to, and what the
Exactly.
makeup should
So
be.
from
Yes.
then, I guess it would come back to you folks as
Okay.
to who and how that's gonna,
Do you
what that's gonna
need
consist of.
more time than the proposed February 28th then, or, okay, you'll make it all work, great. Just wanted to clarify on that. And then, so I just went through a big housing process over the last year, and I know Community Concepts offers classes, so I think they could help with some of the education points that were talked about. And then also, third parties were talked about quite a bit, and, my realtor and my inspection company were really helpful in understanding what the city's requirements were. That's because I asked, because I wanted all the information, so I think if we can work on having relationships with those types of folks, there we go, they could be really useful sources to help disseminate that information as well. I also want to say I've been going to Home Depot a lot, and I always see Jay there, so I know he's actively working on his buildings. And, so I think that's the type of folks who we want to attract as landlords here, those who are here and also spending their money locally, so that they're improving their buildings. So I think that was it. 1 second. One more note buried in here. Oh, tenant education program. Was that just for general assistance? Is that the intention, or?
General assistance was the major focus because that's a group that we can directly communicate with easily.
Yep.
And there are probably ways that we can accomplish that, either if we can't make it mandatory, which some people have said we couldn't, and which may or may not be right, probably is. But I think we can provide incentives that would accomplish the same thing.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
So do we have to extend to this committee by resolve?
Yes, it would be on the next council.
And put something on the 18th so we can
Yep.
let them continue their moonshot.
You bet.
Thank you, Council.
Thanks.
Let's go to who?
Okay, we're now going to have a review of our pedestrian crossing study. All right, we're actually going to take 5 quick minutes for anybody who wants to. Go ahead. Actually,
Where's the
heater?
heater?
That's the heater.
Yeah.
5.
Well, she's supposed to.
What does that do? It's a heater.
I mean.
More parking. We need more parking.
What's that?
Whatever.
All you.
Thank you.
Oh, use the mic because people at home.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, councilors. My name is Richard Burnham. I'm city engineer. Bruce Munger and Ariel Greenlaw are here from HNTV, and they're going to discuss the pedestrian crossing study that is in draft form, and that's what we'll be talking about at the workshop. And we were asked to go quick, so are there any questions? It was really good. Anyway, they'll do the presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay. We will try to be brief with this. We'll go quickly with the slides. But again, we thank you very much for this opportunity to present to you. We've done a fair bit of work in the city of Lewiston. We do a lot of work in other municipalities. I have to say that I really enjoy doing work in Lewiston. You're a great group of people, and really appreciate this great city. So I'll get started. City of Lewiston Pedestrian Crossing Study. As we've moved forward with this, we'll go through the study purpose, the study area, the recent improvements that have already occurred, priority improvements that we've looked at and with staff have addressed these as priority improvements for the city, and then potential new crossings, and then other pedestrian improvements. So again, the purpose of this report is to provide a review of crosswalk conditions along 5 key pedestrian corridors on state highways in the city of Lewiston. This is the study area. And with what we had looked at was, again, what had been done previous to this. There had been the Bike Coalition of Maine hosted a Safe Routes to School meeting back in February of 2016, and these are some of the main comments that were a result of that meeting, and taking that into account with the study. Again, after the Bike Coalition of Maine hosted, there were 2 heads-up forums in the city of Lewiston, May 2017 and November 2018. In addition, they provided funding for a walking school bus and helped organize bike train at 2 local Lewiston schools. This isn't the first push to increase safety from the city. Pedestrian safety has been a concern before the recent push as part of the Make Lewiston Safer. Recent improvement, this is the crossing where there was a fatality, and this had been previously improved. Early summer, they added high visibility striping over all city crosswalks in these corridors. This is a crossing at the Basilica that was improved. There's a number of things that are going on. State of Maine, Bicycle Coalition, City of Lewiston, and the funding for this. Again, the city has set aside and pledged, and that number's wrong. Oh, there it is, $350,000 for sidewalk improvement and $20,000 for crosswalk improvement over 200. Excuse me, 200,000. Thank you. And again, this has been approved for 5 years. Okay, I'm going to pass it off to Ariel.
So when we were looking at the study, there were a lot of things that we took into account. One of this is the bus routes that are going on. So we want to make sure that all the bus stops, if there's a bus crossing, if we need to have a crossing near a bus stop, that was taken into account. The next are schools. A lot of this was centered around children and trying to make sure that they have safe crossings, safe routes to school. The next thing would be locations of parking. So if there's parking garages with major drivers where pedestrians need to have access to other uses, we want to make sure we take that into account. So for each corridor, there were 5 corridors. We took into account the sidewalks that were already existing and looked for any sidewalk gaps. This was Main Street. This is actually a very well-developed corridor, so that was pretty good. And we looked at where signals were, so there were potential crossings that had high visibility. And then we also looked at the existing crossings that were there that were both signalized and unsignalized. So we took all of this, we put it together, and we came up with a priority table of 11 key crossings that could use improvements that would greatly benefit the city of Lewiston, and I'll kind of just walk through them really quickly so that we don't spend a ton of time. But the first one is the Main and Middle Street. There are difficulties with pedestrian crossings for left-turning vehicles because of sight distance here. It's a wide crossing, and it's a pretty heavily used pedestrian crossing. It was recently upgraded to high visibility crosswalks, and what we recommended here was a 2-stage pedestrian crossing and some ADA improvements. The next one is the Main and Lisbon Street. Here again, there's difficulties with sight distance. There isn't a pedestrian refuge. It's a wide crossing, and it's also another heavy pedestrian crossing connecting to the parking garages. It was also recently upgraded to high visibility crossing. You'll see a trend there. And again, here we recommended APS push buttons, ADA improvements, and reducing that turning radii to kind of try to help the cars from speeding around the corner there. At Main and Canal Streets, it was difficulty for left-turning vehicles to get down Canal. If you see, they stop pretty far back and they can't see people crossing Canal Street. It's another pretty well-used pedestrian crossing, and there were multiple bike ped crashes at this location, so it's an area of pretty decent concern. ADA improvements here, reducing the turning radii, and more high visibility. At the intersection of Main and Lincoln Streets, we looked at crossings from the park. It's a wide crossing. There's a location of a bicycle fatality here. And I will caution the cyclist was under the influence, but it's still an area that is of concern. And there are high speeds. This crossing was recently upgraded as well, but we also recommend maybe doing a 2-stage pedestrian crossing, signalizing with red turn arrows, improving pedestrian signage, and doing ADA improvements. At Main and Sabattis Street, this was recently upgraded to high visibility, but we recommend improved pedestrian signage and ADA improvements at this location. At Main and Bates, again, it was recently upgraded with the high visibility pavement markings, but we recommend improved pedestrian signage and ADA improvements. And you'll kind of notice a theme. These first ones are Main Street. We really felt like this was a corridor of key concern. Here, this is the same as the others. It's been recently upgraded with high visibility pavement markings, but we also recommend that there's improved pedestrian signage and the ADA is improved at this location. Moving on to Sabattis, Oak, and Bartlett Streets. This is a pretty complex 5-leg intersection. It is a bike ped crash and high vehicular crash location, so it's an area of safety concerns. Here we recommended improved pedestrian signage, ADA improvements, and some more visibility for the pedestrians that are out there. At Sabattis, Howe, and Wood Streets, this was just another one that was upgraded with high visibility pavement markings, and we recommend improved pedestrian signage, ADA improvements, and rectangular rapid flashing beacons because it's a mid-block crossing. At Canal and Ash Streets, they've done a lot of improvements recently on Canal Street, and here we just recommended some ADA improvements. At Canal and Pine, very similar. They've done some great improvements there and just taken it that one extra step further. So we focused on 11 key intersections. Those are our priority 1 intersections. Those are the ones that are most heavily used, most nearly slated for improvements. And so we did analyze the 5 key corridors. And if we were to do everything, I just wanted to kind of give you guys a cost of what those things total. And it certainly would be incremental. It would be done when development occurred. It would help guide you towards future projects. So if you have something that's coming in, hey, this is great, this is really what we need you to do here to make that crossing safe so that you can have that use. Another thing that we were tasked with was looking at potential new crossings, and we looked at 8 potential new crossings, a couple on Main Street, Sabattis, Lisbon Street, and Canal Street. The last 3, when we looked at them, they weren't really good candidates, whether they were safety concerns for crossings. So we recommend studying those top 5 ones further, and I'll just pop through those ones super quickly. At Main and Mountain Street, there's this huge gap on Main Street between Fry and Russell, and there's a lot of non-compliant pedestrian activity out there, and we want to make sure that people have a safe place to cross so that they're not crossing inappropriately and getting hurt. While there aren't many draws, it definitely seemed to draw pedestrians somehow, and it was requested also from the Bike Coalition meetings that there was something there. And high speeds are definitely out there, so if there was a crossing that was placed out there, it needs to have special consideration for visibility and slowing people down, maybe some different devices. At Main, Montello, and Landry, this is another spot where there was a large gap, and there are bus stops out here, so that's a key driver for pedestrian activity. It's also a high crash location for vehicular activity, so that would need to get improved if you put a pedestrian crossing out there, and it would need to be high visibility as well, again, because they're speeding out there. And then the last one on Main is this Martin Shopping Center area, and this is also a spot where there's a bus stop. And in particular here, there would need to be some improvements if you put a crossing out there. There's all these drive openings that are across the street from the Martins. And there would need to be things where, you know, maybe there was access management or cross connections between those so that there weren't cars constantly coming out who couldn't see around the pedestrians, or pedestrians weren't looking for the cars. We wouldn't want to make a safety concern before by trying to improve their crossing abilities.
And again, that would be for a future
Yes.
redevelopment, not something that, again, the city would undertake, but again, with your access management policies, making sure that when anything is redeveloped out there, that access points are closed, combined, and you try to make it so that it would be a little more pedestrian friendly for that area.
At the intersection of Sabattis, Fairlawn, and Farwell, although there's crossings nearby at Russell Street, it's on the school route and it connects to local uses, so it's kind of an area where consideration would be made. There were 2 pedestrian crashes just east of the site, and this would kind of help lessen the likelihood that users would disobey the traffic laws and provide them some safe crossings. And then we'll just pop very quickly through these. We didn't recommend one at Lisbon and Weber Streets. It's the location of a fatality by a routine user, but it's high vehicular speeds, there are lots of curb cuts, and it's not a safe area to cross, and I don't think, or don't feel that even with high visibility that it would necessarily be a safe crossing location.
And just so you're aware, there's criteria that Maine DOT holds a crosswalk to in terms of sight distance, speed, and if it's something that, again, they don't recommend putting a crosswalk in an area where the speed limit is greater than 35 miles per hour. It may not be posted greater, but if prevailing speeds are greater than that. And that's part of what we had to look at here. So I don't know.
No, that's great. And at Lisbon and Jones Street, this is also not a safe area for crossing. There are also high vehicular speeds here, and even if there was a pedestrian refuge, it's a pretty wide crossing. That's a 5-leg. So that's a tough spot. And then this last one, we just didn't think that there would be enough, might not be enough draw, the Canal Street parking garage. There was talk about maybe seeing what kind of pedestrian activity is actually out there to see if that crossing would be worthwhile, but that one's kind of on the back burner.
So at what point on where?
I think just like crossing,
Canal?
there were a lot of people who were crossing from, the parking garage to the other side of the street, and I don't know.
Towards the mill, number 5?
Yeah. No, I don't.
That lines up with the pedestrian crossing of the canal over to the Bates Mill complex.
Isn't there a
Parking
crosswalk?
garage is on this side from the,
But there's already crosswalks. I think I'm thinking.
I think there's one, yeah, it's not right there.
Towards one side, not the other. Okay.
Okay.
Yep, and so just kind of some additional recommendations out there for further evaluate the pedestrian ramps for ADA standards and consider pedestrian involvement. One of these things, I don't know, the town of Yarmouth recently did a full-scale survey of their area. They involved users, and they had them go out and they had survey areas. so that they could make sure that everything was ADA compliant and so that they could update as they had the ability to. We talked about bringing side streets up to current ADA standards, as those are kind of the bottom of the list. We really want to make sure that we have the main crossings first. Evaluate corridor curb cuts using access management standards. This is really important because if you have a lot of drives in between, they're not looking for pedestrians out there, and that's when a lot of pedestrians can get hurt. Evaluating mid-block crossings to encourage pedestrians to avoid unsafe illegal crossings. That's really key, but we just want to make sure that we don't create unsafe conditions as we're adding in mid-block crossings. Ensuring all pedestrian heads are counted down with APS push buttons and that crossing times meet MUTCD guidelines. Basically, all that's saying is making sure that a pedestrian, when they step off that curb, they know how much time they have to cross the street and that it's adequate no matter who the user is. Removing pedestrian ramps that no longer lead to crossings. We did see a couple of these. There were just kind of remnants. Control vehicular speed and alleviate safety concerns at high crash locations. This is pretty key. If you already have vehicular problems, adding pedestrians to the mix doesn't help anybody's safety out there. Evaluate lighting at vehicular and pedestrian levels. Replace bulbs with LEDs. So when the opportunity is available, using those LEDs to better light pedestrian level is the key, and that's a much more reasonable solution than just replacing the whole structure out there and trying to add lights. Creating a bicycle and pedestrian safety campaign, encouraging high visibility clothing. That is one of the things that the Heads Up was doing. So just continuing that, and a lot of the people who are getting hit at night, they're dressing in dark clothing, they're not paying attention. It's just really important that they're also responsible for themselves. It's not just the vehicles. Enforcing jaywalking. Considering bike lanes where they're available, if there's not a whole lot of space out there, but if there is an area where all of a sudden it starts getting some good bike traffic, I think that's important. And then there's the sidewalks in general are in good repair, but there are some areas where people block the sidewalks with their trash. And then there's this large gap by Bates College, and I know you guys are familiar, but I think evaluating that further and encouraging that dialogue with them, there's a pretty decent goat track there. People are using that area, so you want to make sure that they're safe. There's no crossings out there, so if they go over to use that, they're not doing so safely. And I believe that was the site of another crash, so.
Questions? Thank you for your time.
Councilor LaJoy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You've got a number of streets here. How about Lincoln Street? Is it, why, it was left out, I see here. Is it because it was felt that it was okay in regards to crossings?
No.
Or just weren't asked to do it?
So we used 3 different priorities in terms of the crossings, which way we wanted to upgrade, and that was kind of at the request of the city. So the first priority are the ones that need to be done immediately, and I think the ones on Lincoln Street ended up being a 2 or 3. So they're just the next phase. And we just I didn't want to, there was a lot of crossings, so I didn't want to go through them all tonight with you guys. But.
Well, the reason I ask is because that Lincoln Street is being used more now to not to go through the red lights on Lisbon Street, so they use, Lincoln Street from South Avenue to come into town, and vice versa. So it's being used quite a bit. I was just wondering.
Yeah, I can definitely take just another quick look at that too.
Councilor Cludier.
So first of all, I'm happy to see all the work we've done in terms of switching out to high visibility crosswalks. That was a request of Dave, and I'm glad to see that we've gotten a lot of it done, so thank you. And then secondly, are any of these priority 1 recommendations up for federal or state funding? I know sometimes we...
We do have some projects, especially along the Main Street corridor, where they're going to be doing from basically Longley Bridge all the way out to Pettingill. And we're going to try and tie, the plan is to try and tie in some of these projects along that corridor and get them done with federal funding as part of it and stuff. So you're thinking exactly the way we're thinking.
Great. And then following up on that, I'm I'm assuming that we'll see maybe some of these recommendations during the budget process?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And then lastly, nothing to do with you, but because it's on my mind, because we're talking about traffic, the intersection of Birch and Bates Street, there is currently a stop sign for the, on Bates, but not on Birch. And there's a hill coming up from Birch, and then if cars are parked on both sides of the street, it's really hard for you to see, like, whether or not you can pull out or not. So I'm wondering if we could have the PD look at whether that might be a good place for a four-way stop instead of a two-way stop.
Kind of hard to move.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Council Beam?
I just had a question about the 35-mile
Sure.
speed limit thing. So Lisbon Street, I don't know what the speed limit is, although I drive it a lot. Are there speed limit signs on Lisbon Street? 35, is it 35?
Yes, I believe most of these corridors that we looked at, the speed limit actually is 35.
Right.
Now, you've got prevailing speeds, which can be higher
And
than that.
certainly Lisbon Street is one of those, especially even when you get really close to in town too, not just out in the country. But you were tasked to just look at crosswalks, is that right? Or
Yes, ma'am.
upgrading crosswalks, which is excellent. I'm really glad all this is being done. It's wonderful. I just know that a couple of years ago, we had a problem with a section of Lisbon Street that needed a crosswalk. And perhaps some lights needed a lot. There had been a couple of fatalities, and it never happened. It was my first term.
Sure, if there's I don't want to put you on the spot right now, but if there's something you think of after the meeting,
So
a specific location, I would be happy to go back and take a second look at it.
it's actually, I think, a location that you did not recommend for a crosswalk.
Oh, because of the
it's-
speeds?
Yes, and because it's a 5-lane.
It's 5 lanes, yeah.
It was really not a good area for cars to see, but perhaps, certainly, I think we need something there.
That's one of the things I want to ask these folks to deal
know
with
what
a
I'm
little bit
talking
more,
about.
is because that was one of the issues that was brought up, was it's difficult to get across Lisbon Street once you get out further. And you've come up with the theory that there's really no solution to that right now?
Well, there are solutions. There's always a solution if you're willing to pay the money. And that's, a lot of this is cost. It's the benefit cost analysis that we look at when we do this. Main DOT for Lisbon Street, you have signals, you have crosswalks at signals, you have pedestrian facility. Mid-block crossing, areas where there's not a signal to cross safely, especially when there's that many lanes of traffic,
You wouldn't want people
you really don't want people doing that.
without a light.
Without a light. Now, there are types of signals for pedestrian crossings.
Right.
That, in fact, within the report, there's a discussion of a crossing that we didn't go over here at Maine Medical Center. And that's a very difficult crossing. But our understanding is that crossing can't go away because there's a parking lot on one side and the hospital's on the other. There needs to be, again, we were hesitant to make any recommendations because I think it needs to be the city, Maine DOT, and Central Maine Medical Center that come together and decide how they want to do that. Just in passing, I talked to the state traffic engineer last night at a town council meeting and mentioned this to him. It's a Hawks signal. It basically, when the signal is actuated, it starts flashing yellow to give vehicles a warning, and then it goes to flashing red, so they have to stop. The difficulty at Maine Medical Center is going to be, you have two signals that bookend that, and they really need to be coordinated with that.
Right.
So there's a fair bit of work that needs to be done with that. Now, could you do a mid-block on Lisbon Street with a Hawk signal? Yes, you can. But caution that in terms of safety.
So you think, my takeaway tonight would be that it's not safe to do anything there?
I
What
wouldn't.
would make it, would something make it safer?
They're just really high volume traffic areas. I was at the zoo in Washington DC. I don't know if anyone's ever been there, but the parking.
Yes, I was just there, actually.
Right, and when you cross from the parking lot to the zoo, there is actually a fully signalized crossing with full traffic signals. You press that button and you cross 6 lanes of traffic.
Wow, yeah.
So can it be done?
Tied into other signals.
It's tied in with other signals as well, it's coordinated. Can it be done?
The bookends, the
Yep.
place that we're talking about, but there are 2 neighborhoods, and people go from one neighborhood to the other across Lisbon Street a lot. And a lot of elderly people live in those neighborhoods, and so in order to get to a light, they have to climb a hill. And then cross, and then go down a hill, and then back up and cross and down. And so it makes it tempting for them to just try to get across when the light is red over there or over there. So that's, but.
We could come up with a future.
Maybe just to give us something to look at and think
An
about.
idea of what that would be.
Yeah.
We haven't had accidents in 2 years, so that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Council Marco?
Thank you.
Earlier you stated that you looked at state roads.
Yes.
Okay. And to piggyback on Councilor Joy's question on Lincoln Street, because if I'm not mistaken, Lisbon Street goes down to Cedar now, down to Lincoln, out to Maine, before you can go left or right on 202. So isn't that the state road, Cedar to Lincoln?
So we did look at state roads. We looked at 5 specific corridors. It probably could have been a little bit more specific, but.
Because I think you had it charted out as Lisbon Street all the way to Maine.
And that is what we looked at.
And the reason I'm interested, Dave Jones knows, is a crossing at approximately River Street and Lincoln Street Circle, where there can be as many as 100 children up there in the morning waiting for a bus. Because of a constituent concern, I did go down one morning, and there was a crosswalk guide, but it seemed to still be a very difficult spot, especially with the speed of traffic, people commuting to work along that corridor. It would be very easy to ignore someone with a yellow vest and hit somebody. And they seem to cross there more so than they do at Lincoln and Cedar. There may be some crossing, I think Dave has mentioned, there is some crossing by the Franco Center. I'm not sure to what purpose. What's that, to Oxford Street?
Yep.
That's new. Then there's pedestrian refuge that's just been built.
But is that because someone living on Oxford Street cuts across to Little Canada and makes their way to that Lincoln Street Circle?
The problem we had there, yes, exactly. People were crossing from Oxford Street, going across 5 lanes of traffic at a unmarked intersection.
Right.
And when we redesigned that street, we, number one, took the 5 lanes down to 3, and we added a pedestrian island. It is, you have to walk a little bit down Cedar Street toward the bridge before you can go across, because we couldn't interfere with left-turning traffic. But it's an improvement. If people will be willing to walk 50 extra feet, they'll be a lot safer.
And the other crosswalk that you were talking about, Counselor, is addressed in the full report, and they did have some recommendations on what we can do to improve some of that down there as well, so.
So it was looked at.
So it is in there, it's just one that in the top tier of projects that they were most concerned about, so.
I'll also just quickly add that some of these recommendations are a lot easier to implement than others, such as signage. That's not a huge cost item. So it's not, we're not sitting here saying we're only going to go down the list. We're going to probably pick away at these things as we get a chance.
Yep.
So, I mean, to me, the most important thing I see on here is the safety campaign, because I know a lot of our accidents and even some of our fatalities were pedestrian error, not following your basic elementary school safety procedures when crossing a street. I almost hit 2 people on Bartlett Street today going to get a hot chocolate because they're stepping out behind cars and they're wearing dark clothing, they're not paying attention where they're going, the phone's in the face. It happens all the time. You know, if you have a driver that may be looking at their phone, it doesn't take much. And we can paint all the lines we want on the road and put all the signs up we want. That doesn't save a life necessarily if the pedestrians aren't properly educated and the drivers aren't also not distracted. So I think it's a combination of everything. I think we have some good recommendations in here and some areas that we do need to focus on. But that safety, that safety campaign is vitally important to reduce those, pedestrian-caused errors and distracted driving. That's also another really big one. So I think we have to tackle it from everywhere. We can't paint the lines, put up the signs, and think we've solved the problem, because it didn't necessarily. Councilor Lyson.
Thank you, Mayor. On that education thing, I think that I attended both of those workshops, and there was some discussions about, the last one focused on education and enforcement, right? So to me, the discussion again says, why isn't this part of the curriculum in schools? And I'm going to challenge you, Councilor Cloutier, to take a look at that maybe at the state level.
Councilor Ray now.
No,
State level.
Oh, state level. No, the state. They said the state level. They've make it a part of the core curriculum and make let's say third grade and sixth grade and ninth grade, somewhere along the continuum of education, because kids, where are they going to learn this? Where is the education going to happen? And I think more appropriately in schools, and a lot of it has to do with kids getting safely to school and back as well. So I'm just suggesting that rather than reinventing the wheel here for the city, that we can maybe encourage the state to include that in the curriculum, and there's been proposals for that. So,
and that's the walking school bus and all those things are kind of, and the Bicycle Coalition of Maine, I know, works very hard with the schools to try to work on that. So that's definitely something moving forward that I know that they would. I talked to them recently, so I know that they'd be happy to work with you guys on.
Did you have your? Yeah. Councilor Payne.
Just real quick, just to kind of echo the mayor's statement that regardless of how bright we paint crosswalks, nobody's paying attention to them, whether it's pedestrians or drivers. Is there anything maybe in the full report that speaks to road diets? Because we all know the crux of the issue is how fast cars are traveling. And I don't remember the statistic, you guys probably do, but it's cars traveling at 25 miles per hour, it's 60% chance to live if you're in a crash. 35, it's 50, and then if a car is traveling faster than 40 miles per hour, it's almost always a fatality. I drive 40 miles per hour almost everywhere in town. There's nothing in our road design that makes cars go slower. Our roads are so wide. I've had many conversations with the mayor over the last 3 years about the need for wide roads because of snow removal and things like that. But is there any talk about road diets or road design in the full report?
No. So we focused purely on the crossings, but that could be certainly something I could add some to the report, because I think that's a very valid.
Yeah.
Sorry. Road and I used to work for Maine DOT. I was Southern Region traffic engineer for 3 years. Road diets are a great thing. But as far as recommendations, really don't want to go there, because that's something that is really a discussion between the municipality and Maine DOT. Mobility is always a factor. You have some roads that are mobility corridors, and you need to decide with the city and with Maine DOT, do you want to sacrifice mobility for pedestrian, for, I'll give you an example. I work with the city of Portland. I really very much prefer working with the city of Lewiston. Their focus has very much been pedestrian, and their mobility is suffering. And their goal is not to promote mobility. And they've gotten permission from Maine DOT to sacrifice mobility for safety. Now, it's a balance. I really hesitate making any recommendations on road diet because it's so much a philosophy of what do you as a city want your city to be. And I know you want safe roads, but a road diet's a really big step towards doing that and kind of way beyond what we had discussed.
And you're exactly right. We've tried road diets.
Yeah,
It's some success.
It's a big...
And we do have a proposal that will be coming up for East Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but like even with road diets, things such as bump outs at crosswalks, reducing the distance that pedestrians have to travel. All the designs that we're looking at now include bump outs, pedestrian refuges, pedestrian islands, things of that nature. That way, even if it's not technically a traditional road diet like we did over by Oxford Street, where we removed 1.5 lanes of traffic, that area looks beautiful. I drive by it driving my kids to school. But if this is in the interest of keeping people safe and more importantly keeping students safe, I watched a water delivery truck or something drive by my school as I was loading a student on a bus, just blast right by. This is a 5-year-old kid that I'm walking down to go put on the bus. The guy didn't even stop, didn't even have one of those "oh my god" moments and like screech on the brakes, further on down the road. Just kept on trucking. Unfortunately, it looked like the bus driver pulled out and tried to chase him. But it's people need help to pay attention.
Yeah, traffic calming and other things that play into that.
Right.
I would say more than a road diet.
Yeah.
I was thinking more.
That's a whole separate
maybe that was a
study.
bad term, but traffic calming.
Traffic calming. It's again same road diet, traffic calming.
Right.
It's a philosophy that again I don't think we could address it fully here. It's a big undertaking.
Yeah.
And if that's something the city wants to undertake, be glad to do it. But it'd be more than what we were looking to do with this one.
Would it be appropriate to put in the recommendations for further evaluation down in the?
I don't want to put you on the spot as this whole council are doing, asking for it, but I guess I
do it to myself, so
Okay.
don't worry about it.
Keep in mind, folks, the scope of this project was to look at our pedestrian crossings and to identify where we had shortcomings and where we should prioritize our efforts on. All of this other stuff that we're talking about is all good stuff, and I don't want to steer you away from it, but that wasn't within the scope of this project on this one.
We can make our roads undrivable and less business-friendly in another study.
Right.
So. All right. Any other questions? Oh, Jolene, sorry.
Thank you. Just real quick, I would support a diet or whatever.
Traffic calming.
I'm with you on that.
Traffic
So
calming.
if it comes later on, we have an ally. But this happened to me tonight, and so that's why I thought of it. You did recommend lighting at crosswalks.
Yes,
Is that
absolutely.
Right? For nighttime?
It's actually a requirement.
Okay,
For the MUTs, the manual uniform traffic control devices.
And LED lights?
LED are
Those brighter?
as opposed to your mercury vapor, your halide, those,
Whatever we
you
have
have a very bright white light.
Whatever. because I did come, I was driving down, what's that street, Ash Street? Yes, down Ash Street, yeah, that's the one that comes to town. And I was going the wrong way, but I was driving down Ash Street, and there were 3 people crossing, and they were probably not in front of me, but I saw them as I hit the crosswalk because they were all dressed in black, all 3 of them. And all of a sudden I just saw this, so I just hope that maybe we can look into our lights. But you did make that a recommendation, so that's great. That'll happen probably.
That's in our recommendations, is
Yeah.
some further evaluation, and just, as you're improving those intersections, taking a look at that and seeing.
At the lights.
Yep.
Of course, with the daylight savings time changing,
Oh,
the
yeah.
time change has made it darker earlier, and it just seems really, really dark. So I'm glad it's there. Thank you.
Councilor Ray?
So I appreciate the thoughtfulness on the 2-stage crossings for Main Street. I know there are some folks who live in that area who have asked us for that before, and we haven't been able to come to it. I mean, even today, it's so cold out, and I have really bad asthma, and I got pretty winded walking across the street today, which was very sad. The 2 questions I had were, and I'm sorry, I don't have the full report in front of me, so I can't look back, but were the bus route stops from the school district included in understanding this?
No, and, that's something, I started talking with the Bicycle Coalition of Maine, and we were talking about safe routes, and I guess you guys don't have formal safe routes to school adopted yet, and that's something that you're working on. So that is something that progresses. I think, some additional crossings may come out of that, but until that is, and there's often funding available when there's safe routes to school that are formally identified. So that's a nice opportunity as that progresses.
Okay, great, that's awesome. And the Bicycle Coalition is working on that?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's,
I believe so.
I don't know who's working on safe routes to school.
What's the question?
Safe routes to school is,
It's Darcy Whittemore.
thank you. I was like, who do I contact? And then the.
Is it ATRC?
It could be ATRC too. I could be getting them mixed up.
Not yet.
Bicycle
Okay.
Coalition of Maine has been doing a little bit of work on that with the
Okay.
schools, both in Auburn and Lewiston.
Yeah,
And they've kind of been
I'll ask Butch
doing that a
too.
little bit in coordination with ATRC, just as through the,
It's just beginning.
yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and then my other question was, is this document available to the public at this point?
It's still in its draft
Yeah.
form. So
Okay.
until we wanted to get your thoughts and opinions before we.
Okay.
Yeah.
put them in.
It will be.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, and I know our only member of the public here is Chair of our Bike Peg Committee. I'm not sure. Craig, did you have anything to?
Committee.
Complete Streets Committee, that's the one. Did you have anything for public comment?
I don't think I have anything to add.
All right.
This is the first time I'm hearing about, or learning where the study's at, so I don't know.
Figured I'd offer you. You're the only one still here, so. Okay. Anyone else from the council? Richard?
Just 2 last things.
Oh, grab the mic, Richard, for the folks at home.
Now it's on record.
That's all right.
Anyway, it's a draft study, just want to underscore that, so it's not a problem to add these things to it. And there is another state project significant redoing Savannah Street from Main to Pettingill, so we'll be asking them to incorporate these improvements too, not just Main Street. So it's pretty significant.
Beautiful, thank you. All right. Have a great night.
Thank you for your time.
It's not.
I did make a 53 shows a overhead, so I made some notes.
If you want to see.
Okay.
The train.
Is it you or Dennis doing the
All
signage?
3 of us are going to be involved in this
All
one. so
3 of you?
It's a team effort, yes.
You get 2
Team
minutes
effort.
apiece.
We have talked about the idea of coming up with brand and a marketing approach for the city for a long time. At one point, there was an effort to try to get a consolidated program between Lewiston, Auburn, the Chamber, and LAGC. That project went down the road, and then, of course, as political events transpired, it faded away. Chamber went in its own direction. LAGC eventually went away, and, well, kind of went away. It's now been subsumed by the Chamber. So we've never really gotten there. One of the clear things that we do not have as a city is something that's clearly identifiable as the city. Everybody uses different letterheads. Our cars are marked poorly. Our seal, which is a lovely historic thing, is way too complicated and is difficult to interpret. So one of the things we've started thinking about is whether it's possible to come up with something that would serve as a brand, feed into marketing efforts, and also assist with the whole image issue that the community has. So that's my kind of introduction, and Heather and Dennis have been working on this, and I'll turn it over to them.
I'll expand just briefly on the marketing strategy portion of this. I think that oftentimes, and I think whether it be the city or any organization, it's not just the initial step off of a new logo and design and your work is done. I think that staff needs some guidance in terms of the ongoing work. So as we continue, that's where the strategy comes in, and working with a company to actually build that strategy for the long term, or at least for the, for the foreseeable future. So we're putting out our message in a consistent way, but we're also not just stale and staying with the same, okay, we got a new logo, we got a new brand, everybody's happy. There's much more to it. Our messaging is key and staying up with that. So I think it's important that we give some guidance to staff in that regard. I think we have Facebook pages, throughout the city that are managed by staff, and I think it's important that we give them those tools or that strategy behind the scenes that gives them that guidance, so they're not constantly having to think about, does this meet the city's mission in terms of branding and logos? That will give them that guide, and I think that that's a really critical document or critical strategy that we need to build for the staff.
I guess I would start with, I've been here when the Setting the Pace was first initiated, which is our marketing logo. That's probably about 15, 20, Mr. LaJoy, you might remember that. And then we went to the All-American City. That kind of was our logo, if you will, for a while. We are in dire need of something that provides some cohesiveness for all the departments. And also potentially a tagline that really impacts when you're doing social media to recognize that it's from City of Lewiston. And then there's several kind of sub-projects that can be addressed with that. One may be the image campaign. The other one is an employee recruiting tool. We are doing some recruiting, our target recruiting for the police station. That may be expanded, but one of the things that we were asked is, what is our logo that we use? What is our marketing? What's our tagline and so forth? And we don't have a current one right now. So that's kind of what I see. I'm currently on a board that has just gone through this process, and they target not only taglines, the emojis, the social media. Everything is all connected, the color coding, how your business cards look, your signature on those things, but as well as what messages go out. And they target, and it's not a bombardment of press releases or Facebook posts or tweets. So when something does go out, people tend to pay more attention to it, and it's more strategic from that standpoint. So you will see, as part of the LCIP, you will see a placeholder for the marketing campaign. It would be up to council if that's an endeavor they want to pursue prior to July 1st. Then we can talk about potentially using some fund balance funds for that. Otherwise, we can program that in and discuss it as part of budget and LCIP deliberations.
Questions, comments, concerns? Councilor Ray.
What kind of scale of budget would, I don't know what's appropriate for this.
Interestingly enough, the board that I just talked about, it was a quick email this afternoon. They did their first year for $16,000. The sleeper cost is not in hiring the marketing firm. It's in changing all of the forms, the business cards, the logos on the vehicles, check stock,
many business cards.
utility bills, all of that would need to be changed. That's where your hidden cost comes.
And some of that, of course, can be phased in over time. I would just like it that if something shows up in somebody's mailbox, when they pull the letter out, they instantly can tell it's from the city of Lewiston.
Right. Sounds great.
So is there a desire to do it any earlier than the budget deliberations?
I mean, is there stuff we can do now and then, you know, on the long term? I mean, you tell us. I mean, in some, like with the stationery, if we needed to replace the stationery anyway, is there really an additional cost to go to a different logo, or is it kind of the same cost after the design's absorbed?
Do we have a closet full of the old
Yeah.
stationery?
Actually, I still have a pack of stationery that has the setting the pace on the top, so, you know, you
don't use a lot of stationery.
No.
Most of us have gone, at least I would think most of us have gone
Electronically.
electronic. So, I mean, the letterhead we use in our office is electronic.
Right.
It's just printed out as the letter goes out. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that people may still be using that's got kind of turning brown around the edges. And it might be time to just throw it away and clean it up.
I mean, if it were up to me, I would like to see the firm solicitation happen from an RSFP process to start getting ideas and leave the placeholder in the LCIP to expand on that, to do some of our special targeted areas, to do media campaigns and implement some of the recommendations.
So, okay.
Okay.
Like something.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else have anything final to add? All right, go home.